estos aparatos.
Para que Guatemala avance, tiene que haber justicia por las vidas que fueron tomadas y la tierra que fue robada.
A usted lo acusan de la comisión del delito de genocidio.
En Guatemala no hubo genocidio, en ningún régimen. En Guatemala no hubo genocidio.
No voy a descansar hasta verlos en la cárcel.
No es fácil ver a un asesino a los ojos y decirle, tú mataste a mi familia.
No ha habido ninguna prueba que evidencie mi participación.
Ordenando su ingreso directamente a prisión.
Que las juntas directivas al frente.
Y los pueblos indígenas van a defender lo que les queda de territorios con la propia vida.
El pueblo va a tomar el poder de Guatemala.
So how did you get in this business of a film documentarian, well-known, long resume? How did that aha moment occur?
Well, for me, it was a kind of a circuitous route because I think the one thing that links different things I've done in my life is being a producer and wanting to promote culture as well as social justice in some way or another. And so, I grew up in Latin America during times of dictatorships. I saw, when I was 11 years old, saw the tanks roll out in Brazil and the Air Force planes come overhead when they did the military coup that lasted for 18 years. And then, similar things in Argentina and Chile, and I just had this sense of really being wary about power exercised through force, the unjustness of it, people being disappeared, tortured, the inequities in the society, all of that. But I never got into film until I met Pamela, because before that I was doing music events that were sort of cultural events to bring people together.
You were a promoter? Or?
I was promoting it, exactly. I had a Caribbean music festival in Cartagena, Colombia, that was really, the idea behind it was to bring together Caribbean culture in one place, but from all different languages in the Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean, English Caribbean, Dutch Caribbean, French Caribbean. And underlying it, all Caribbean culture is Afro, Indigenous, and European. So that combination in different forms, it was a really, I think the event was very successful. It took place in a bull ring with 20,000 people, 4 nights in a row. And I think that the reason it was so successful was because it sort of opened people's eyes to this cultural affinity that they had with each other. Music was the universal language. And it was because of that music experience that Pamela looked me up. Several people told her that she should call me because she was preparing a documentary about music on the north coast of Colombia, which is exactly where I had the festival. So that led me into the documentary world, and I haven't looked back.
Now, do you do that exclusively? Is that it? Is that your genre?
That's what I do. Yeah, the fiction genre is so different that honestly I wouldn't know how to do it. Directing actors, going through scripts, following a script. In a documentary we have a treatment, we have an idea, we have a guide, but then things happen. And you have to be prepared to deal with things happening that you couldn't expect. Like in the film people are going to see here at the Dialogs, it's called 500 Years. I would say that the third act of the film in particular came as a total surprise to us. We saw there was change coming, but the way it came, we needed to be very nimble and to document that. So that's and I love documentary because documentary is actually happening. It's real. I mean, you see a lot of films that say based on a true story, and that's good. But the true story is something.
Well, when you got something like you do, which is a work in progress, literally as you're filming.
Yes. It is.
You don't know. How do you get access? I mean, you have the antagonist, you have the protagonist, you've got the alleged perpetrators, and you want to get this point, counterpoint. Sometimes they know you're coming. How do they get access? Well,
they know we're coming, let's say, or if they know us, they know that we have a particular point of view and perspective on that issue. But also, we give them a chance to speak their mind, to put their position forward. And for that reason, many times they do speak, other times not. I mean, sometimes the antagonists don't want to, be on camera with us when it's our camera. What we found is that people on the other side of the spectrum, let's say, have started making their own films too, which is interesting. Yeah, this happened in Guatemala. This guy who runs a very extreme right, I would call it neo-fascist organization, called the Foundation Against Terrorism, and their symbol is a dagger pointing down with the scales of justice hanging from the hilt of the dagger, and it's like even a fascist symbol. So but he got together with some people, a filmmaker and all. They made a film about the army being the victims in the conflict.
Were they showing it at the same time you're showing yours?
No, it came out later, but not that much later. Yeah. And it was a fiction film, so that's different too. 500 years when it came out in Guatemala was really momentous. It was a huge event. We opened at a theater that held 1,500 people, and there are at least another 1,500 out in the street that couldn't get in. It was a reminder to people of the power of justice, the power of people when it comes together. Because it has the Genocide Trial, which was a landmark trial. The Genocide Trial in Guatemala was the first time in history that the genocide of indigenous people has been put on trial. So that's incredible. And it was done really by the Mayan people. They pushed it to happen. The victims led the way there. So that was that. And that really sent a shockwave through Guatemalan society, especially at the upper levels. The second one is where the victims, especially led by Nobel laureate Rigoberta Menchú, she took the case to Spain, to the Audiencia Nacional, as it's called in Spanish, the national court there that was doing universal jurisdiction cases. Right. But in that case, they asked for the extradition of the Guatemalan generals, but the Guatemalan government wasn't willing to extradite them. But within Guatemala, the justice system got emboldened. Things came together like sometimes they do. The stars aligned. The Attorney General was an incredible woman who just had a lot of courage and went forward. And the judge was also a woman who was, doing a trial that was, really dangerous. I mean, life-threatening for her. But they pulled it off, came to a guilty verdict, and that sent that was like an earthquake in Guatemalan society. So the elite, which is represented really by this group of the 8 families that own most of the businesses in Guatemala, they put a lot of pressure on the Constitutional Court there to reverse the verdict. But what they did was a technical thing. Most people say, it was annulled, but it actually wasn't. It's not that simple. They said that as of like the second week of the trial, things after that had to be redone, which included the verdict. But the first part still stood, and that how would I put it? The evidence wasn't questioned at all. It was like a technicality. Like in the mafia cases, you used to see a Don, get off on a technicality. It was that kind of thing. But Rios Montt remained under house arrest till his death. And the trial was continuing. It ended when he died, but it wasn't over. So, but there's another thing about that which I think is important for people to think about. For the Mayan people, and for most indigenous cultures in the Americas, justice is a restorative process. Now, they don't have prisons. It doesn't make sense for them to, pay to have somebody locked up. What you want is that person back in the community as a productive member of the community. So, in the justice system of indigenous justice systems, people publicly, in front of their community, confess what they did, they air it, they are assigned certain reparations they have to do to the victims of their crimes, and then that is what happens. If a person repeatedly doesn't do that, then they get expelled from the community, but they don't go to a prison. They just are sent out, and they end up in a city, probably in a ghetto, and probably in prison in the city. But for the Mayans, the fact that Rios Montt sat there for 2 months, listening to over 100 testimonies, hearing the truth about what happened, and not being able to just walk away from it, that was very powerful. And they consider that justice. The justice process is justice for them. And in our Western idea of justice, it's got to be a concrete guilty verdict and imprisonment.
Really interesting.
So it's a different idea about justice. Yeah.
Did you want to be a lawyer?
I never thought about being a lawyer. I thought about being a writer. I come from a family of writers, and I actually do write quite a bit of for a lot of proposals for raising the funds for the films that we make, and when you're doing that, you're basically telling stories. Telling a story that you want people to be interested in. So if anything, it would be a writer. My father was a New York Times journalist. And my grandfather was an academic writer, and my uncle. I mean, it's like I say, I come from a family of writers.
And Brazil is your native?
No, I was born in New York City. Okay. My grandfather was Spanish, who came to New York as a pretty young man, 29 years old. He was asked to start the Spanish department at Columbia University. So he came before the Civil War, but then when the Civil War happened, he stopped going back to Spain. So the family just settled in New York. And my father grew up in New York, and then I was born in New York. But that was the Civil War in Spain that sort of created that transplant. And then when I was very young, a year old, we moved to Brazil because my father was assigned there as a journalist. So that's
in Rio?
In Rio.
Oh, yeah.
And then from Rio, we went to Buenos Aires for a few years. And then we went back to Rio,
Gotcha.
All connected to my father's work.
So I asked Pam, what you might say that Pam brings to the table? You guys are a collaboration, you're a partnership.
Yeah.
So I asked her what you would say about what she brings to the table.
Oh, I would say she brings, well, first of all, great skills in filmmaking, but those skills involve great instinct, and knowing how to handle people and making the subjects feel comfortable and a sense of trust. It's a long process. We never jump in with a camera right at the beginning. It's first getting to know people. She's really good at that. People often wonder, what does it mean to be a director of a documentary? Don't documentaries just happen by themselves? No, they don't. Things happen, but then how you tell that story, that's where the director comes in, and who you choose to be the protagonist of that story. Mm-hmm. That makes a huge difference. Are you going to choose some expert academic to talk about what happened, or are you going to have the person who's actually living what happened be the spokesperson? Right. Those kinds of decisions really make the difference. So if you look at documentaries with that in mind, you'll see how different documentaries approach like who tells the story, how's it told, and then of course the editing process, which is where the magic happens, so to speak. Editing in documentary is unfortunately very under-recognized, and it's a place where the director plays a big role together with the editor.
So what do you think she said that you bring to the table?
Oh gosh, funding for one, maybe a sense of support for the work in terms of not just money, but a belief in the work. And also as a producer, I'm out there in the field also doing that. So I try to create a space, a creative space, where she can work creatively and not have to worry about a lot of production details. When it goes to the editing room, I try to create that space for her, and for the editor of all our films was Peter Kanoy. And that there, I try to also raise enough money to give enough time. So the more time you have to edit, so that you do it till you feel like, yes, now it's done, and not feel rushed. That's really important for the creative process.
As an independent, do you feel, is that a benefit not to having a big film studio saying you got to have it done in a certain time period, which is sometimes a hard deadline? Do you feel that distinction?
Definitely. No, I as a producer don't like to work that way. We are a very efficient filmmaking ensemble, and we don't having a hard kind of arbitrary deadline because of a broadcast date or something like that. No, we impose our own deadlines on ourselves. It might have to do with the date of a festival, and how long. We have a good sense of how long it will take to finish the film. So those things, but also another one is in terms of the orientation of the story, and what are the the politics, let's say. Maybe that's not the right word, but what are we trying to express in this story? And on that's where we really need to be independent. We don't want to be controlled by a corporation that is worried about its stockbrokers or something like that, and therefore we would not be independent in my mind. Yeah. But that said, when we finish our films, almost all of them have gone to broadcast. So it's not like they don't get broadcast. Almost all of them have been on PBS. And now our latest film not only was it on PBS, it's also on Amazon. Fantastic. So anybody can see it anywhere. And Amazon then also we posted the other two films of the trilogy. So somebody who really wanted to see the Guatemala trilogy can see it all there.
Fantastic. What's a question that I haven't asked you? What's the one that's most asked of you, Paco?
A question you haven't asked me. Gosh, why do I do this work? I don't know. Maybe that's already been answered.
Well,
yeah, you might wonder, gee, why would you spend 3 years making a film and then taking it out there? And I feel that documentary is one vehicle to express what's going on in societies, and can be part of a larger ecosystem for social awareness and social change. It's especially in the times that we're facing right now, it's become even more acute, because I feel that the human rights movement is under siege. There are autocracies rising up everywhere, these populist governments, and populist seems like a misnomer, right? Because it's populist, but it's also repressive. It's these are governments that are actually manipulating democracy to repress people, to take away rights and civil liberties. And so, and to dismantle protections of the environment, of minorities, the list goes on and on. And so I feel that as storytellers, as documentarians, we have a responsibility to put those stories out there as independently, because people need to see these stories. And one characteristic of the stories we tell, I would call them human rights success stories. Even if there's a setback later, because there always are, there's no final victory and there's no final defeat. But when a popular movement in Guatemala manages to topple the president on corruption charges, that's a victory. And even if another corrupt guy comes along, there's a precedent that's been set there. A genocide trial is a precedent-setting thing. And so, or a community of indigenous people that manages to keep a mine from coming into their land and destroying their land. Those, we want people to feel hope and empowerment when they see these stories that are real stories, and they go against, the sort of defeat, denouncing, terrible things that happen. That's all true, and our stories are about something terrible that happened. But how did the victims, and what happened after that? Yeah. How did people take charge of their destiny, and how did they become protagonists of their own history?
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing all that.
Thank you.